Imagine, for a moment, a world where summer is a brief, fleeting whisper and winter is a brutal, thousand-year siege of ice. You wake up one morning, not in a warm bed, but huddled with your family in a crude shelter made of mammoth bones and animal skins, while outside, a glacier, miles thick, grinds its way across the landscape. The air is so cold that when you breathe, the moisture in your lungs freezes into tiny crystals, and the only sound is the howling wind and the distant crack of shifting ice. This was not a nightmare from a distant movie. This was the reality for your ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years during the Pleistocene ice ages. But here is the paradox that shatters everything you think you know. These ancient humans did not just survive these apocalyptic conditions, they thrived. They didn't huddle in caves, starving and miserable, waiting for the ice to recede. They actively conquered the most hostile environment our planet has ever produced. So, how did a species with no fur, no claws, and no natural armor, a species that shivers in a light breeze, manage to not only endure but is spread across the entire globe during the deepest freezes in Earth's history? The answer is not in a single invention, but in a cascade of biological, social, and technological revolutions that transformed a helpless ape into the ultimate survivor. Let's strip away the romanticized image of the shivering caveman and dive into the cold, hard truth. The first, most obvious answer is fire, but you have to understand that controlling fire was not just about warmth. It was about hacking the very laws of physics. Before fire, a human body is a fragile bag of warm water, constantly losing heat to the environment. But with a campfire, your ancestors created a portable sun, a tiny controllable star that allowed them to extend the day, cook food to extract more energy, and, crucially, to survive nights that could drop to minus 40 degrees. The real genius, however, was not just making fire. It was making fire on demand. Early humans didn't just find fire. They learned to create it by striking flint against iron pyrite, a skill so precise that it took years of practice to master. This meant they weren't dependent on lightning strikes or volcanic eruptions. They could carry the potential for fire in a small pouch, ready to ignite a life-saving flame at any moment. But fire alone wasn't enough. You cannot huddle around a campfire when you need to hunt for miles across a frozen tundra. This is where the second revolution comes in, the invention of tailored clothing, and this is far more sophisticated than you imagine. Think about your winter jacket for a second. It's probably synthetic, filled with down or polyester, and it works because it traps a layer of still air around your body. Ancient people figured out this exact principle, but with materials they had to kill with their bare hands. They didn't just throw an animal skin over their shoulders. They developed specialized tools, like bone needles with eyes, to sew complex, multi-layered garments. The evidence comes from sites like the Sungur burial in Russia, where a man from 34,000 years ago was buried wearing a coat adorned with over 3,000 mammoth ivory beads. Those beads weren't for fashion. They were part of a sophisticated system. Each bead was sewn onto the outer layer of the coat, and when the wearer moved, the beads would slide against each other, creating a seal that prevented snow from melting and then refreezing into ice inside the garment. They had waterproofing technology. They understood that animal sinew, when treated, could be used as thread that didn't rot. They knew that the best fur came from animals killed in autumn, when the pelts were thickest. This was not primitive survival. This was high-level textile engineering, developed over tens of thousands of years. Now let's talk about the house. The classic image is a cave, but caves are rare, often already occupied by bears or lions, and they are damp, cold, and dark. The real architectural marvels of the Ice Age were the mammoth bone huts. At sites like Meshirik in Ukraine, archaeologists have found the remains of huts built from the skulls, jaws, and long bones of hundreds of woolly mammoths. Imagine the engineering challenge. You have to arrange these massive bones, each weighing over 100 pounds, into a dome shape that can withstand blizzards and predators. They would dig a shallow pit, then place the largest skulls in a circle, their tusks pointing inward to form a base. Then, they would weave smaller bones and reindeer antlers into a lattice, and finally, cover the entire structure with layers of sod, moss, and animal skins. The result was a structure so well insulated that the inside temperature could remain above freezing even when it was minus 50 degrees outside. These huts were not temporary shelters. They were permanent villages, some inhabited for generations. This required a level of social organization that is staggering. You cannot build a mammoth bone hut alone. It requires a team of at least 20 people working in coordination, sharing knowledge passed down through centuries. This brings us to the third and perhaps most critical survival strategy: social cooperation. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, were not the only humans alive during the Ice Ages. There were Neanderthals who were stronger, stockier, and arguably better adapted to the cold. They had larger brains, bigger bodies, and they had been living in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years before we arrived. Yet, when the climate became truly extreme, around 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals vanished and our ancestors spread. Why? The leading theory is not about individual intelligence, but about social networks. Neanderthals lived in small, isolated bands. When a crisis hit, a failed hunt, a volcanic winter, a disease, they had no one to turn to. But Homo sapiens developed something revolutionary: long-distance trade networks. Archaeologists have found seashells from the Mediterranean in sites in Germany, and flint from hundreds of miles away in other camps. This means that a band in trouble could send a messenger to a neighboring band hundreds of miles away and receive help. They were exchanging information, resources, and, crucially, genes. This genetic mixing made populations more resilient. When one group had a bad season, another group could take them in. This network of mutual support was the ultimate insurance policy against extinction. But let's get even more specific about the biology. You might think that ancient humans were incredibly tough, but in many ways, they were more fragile than us. They had no antibiotics, no vaccines, no hospitals. Yet they survived. They survived because they developed an intimate, almost shamanistic knowledge of their environment. They knew which plants could be chewed to reduce fever, which tree barks could be boiled to make a painkiller, which mushrooms could stop infections. Evidence from Neanderthal skeletons shows they survived severe injuries: broken bones, deep cuts, arthritis that would have been fatal without care. This means they were treating each other. They were setting bones, cleaning wounds, and feeding the injured. For a species to survive the Ice Ages, you need more than just a few strong individuals. You need a society that cares for its weak and its old, because the old carry the knowledge of where to find water when the rivers freeze and how to read the stars to predict the weather. Now, let's talk about the most controversial and fascinating survival tool: food. The Ice Age diet was not a monotonous gnawing on raw mammoth meat. It was a hyper-specialized, high-fat, high-protein engine designed to fuel a brain that consumes 20% of your body's energy. The key was fat. In a cold environment, carbohydrates are scarce, and protein alone cannot sustain you. Eat too much lean meat, and you get rabid starvation, a condition where your liver cannot process the excess protein, leading to nausea, diarrhea, and death. So, ancient humans went after the fattiest animals: mammoths with their thick layers of blubber, seals with their oil-rich meat, and fish like salmon, which packed omega-3 fatty acids. They would eat the bone marrow, the brains, the tongue, all the fatty tissues that modern diets often discard. They even fermented meat in pits, a process that preserved it and added essential vitamins. But here is the mind-bending part. Recent studies of ancient DNA show that humans living in Ice Age Europe had genetic adaptations that allowed them to digest high amounts of fat and cholesterol without developing heart disease. They literally evolved to survive on a diet that would kill a modern person in a few years. They had larger placentas, allowing for faster fetal development in a short summer. They had denser bones, more resistant to fractures. Their bodies were changing in real time, generation by generation, to match the planet's shifting climate. So, let's step back and look at the big picture. The Ice Ages lasted for roughly 2.5 million years, with cycles of advance and retreat. The most recent glacial maximum, about 20,000 years ago, was the peak. Ice sheets covered North America down to what is now New York City, and Europe down to London. Sea levels were over 400 feet lower, meaning you could walk from France to England, from Siberia to Alaska. This was the world your ancestors inherited. They didn't have metal, they didn't have writing, they didn't have agriculture. Yet they crossed continents, they built cities of bone, they created art. The magnificent cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira, and they developed complex spiritual beliefs. They buried their dead with flowers and jewelry, suggesting a belief in an afterlife. They carved figurines of voluptuous women, the Venus figures, which may have been symbols of fertility and survival. They were not just surviving, they were living, loving, and dreaming. And then the ice began to melt. Around 12,000 years ago, the climate warmed dramatically. Forests returned, mammoths went extinct, and the world that had been their home for millennia vanished. But here is the final twist. Their survival strategies, their cooperation, their technology, their adaptability did not disappear. They were the foundation upon which everything else was built. Agriculture, cities, writing, civilization itself. These are all just extensions of the same skills that kept a small group of humans alive during a blizzard in what is now France, 40,000 years ago. So, the next time you complain about a cold day, remember this. You are the descendant of the most resilient, creative, and stubborn survivors the world has ever seen. You carry their genes, their instincts, their fire. And if you want to understand how they did it, you don't need to look at a museum diorama. You just need to look at yourself. The frozen rivers that had been highways for hunters became impassable torrents, forcing humans to relearn the landscape. The great herds of woolly rhinos and bison that had sustained them for generations dwindled into scattered remnants. But the humans did not panic. They had faced extinction before and knew that fear was a luxury they could not afford. They watched the seasons shift, the permafrost soften, and the grasslands transform into dense forests. New animals appeared, deer, boar, and smaller game that required different tactics, different weapons. They adapted their hunting techniques, crafting lighter spears and developing the bow and arrow for stealth in the woods. They learned to fish in the newly formed lakes and rivers, weaving nets from plant fibers and carving hooks from bone. The vast open plains of the Ice Age gave way to a patchwork of environments, and humans became specialists in each niche. Some groups moved north, following the retreating ice, where mammoths clung to the last cold refuges. Others stayed in the warming south, exploiting the abundance of berries, nuts, and edible plants that now flourished. They experimented with new ways to store food, digging pits lined with clay to preserve meat and fish for lean months. They built permanent structures, not just temporary shelters, using wood, stone, and mammoth bones as foundations. These settlements became hubs of social life, where knowledge was shared, marriages were arranged, and stories were told. The population grew, and with it, the need for organization and leadership. Elders emerged as keepers of wisdom, passing down the lessons of survival from one generation to the next. They knew which mushrooms were safe to eat, how to predict storms, and where to find flint for tools. But the warming brought new dangers as well. Melting ice released vast amounts of water, flooding coastal plains that had been home to entire communities. Sea levels rose, submerging land bridges that had connected continents, isolating groups for the first time in millennia. The great beasts that had inspired cave paintings and rituals became legends, their bones scattered across the tundra. Yet humans did not mourn the past. They celebrated the present and planned for the future. They developed new technologies, like the spear thrower, which gave them greater range and power against faster prey. They domesticated the wolf, turning it into a hunting companion that could track and corner animals with unmatched skill. The bond between human and dog grew stronger with each generation, a partnership that would last for thousands of years. They painted new scenes on cave walls, not just animals, but human figures dancing, fighting, and gathering. They carved intricate designs into bone and antler, turning tools into works of art that express their identity. They created music, using hollowed bird bones as flutes and stretched animal hides as drums. The sounds echoed through their camps, a rhythm that synchronized their hearts and minds. They buried their dead with more care than ever, placing them in fetal positions, surrounded by offerings. Some graves contained dozens of shell beads, each one representing a year of a life well lived. They believed that the spirit journeyed to another world, a place where the ice never came and the hunt never ended. They told stories of the stars, mapping constellations that guided them during long winter nights. They watched the moon wax and wane, marking the cycles of women's bodies and the seasons of migration. Time became a concept they could measure, a resource they could manage. They learned to make pottery, baking clay in fires until it hardened into containers for cooking and storage. This allowed them to boil water, extract marrow from bones, and prepare foods that were previously inedible. They discovered that wild grains could be harvested and ground into flour, a precursor to bread. They noticed that seeds dropped near their camps would sprout into new plants, a silent lesson in agriculture. But they did not rush to plant fields. They were still hunters, still wanderers at heart. The Ice Age had taught them patience, and they knew that change came slowly over generations. They observed the natural world with a scientist's precision, noting which plants flowered first in spring and which animals gave birth in autumn. They shared this knowledge through songs and dances, encoding survival information in rhythms and movements. Children learned by watching, by mimicking, by failing, and trying again. Every mistake was a lesson. Every success a step toward mastery. They lived in groups of 20 to 50 people, a size that allowed for cooperation without overburdening resources. When tensions arose, they resolved them through ritualized combat or mediation by elders. Violence was rare because survival depended on trust, and trust was more valuable than any weapon. They cared for the injured and the elderly, knowing that wisdom and experience were irreplaceable. A broken leg could heal with a splint, but a broken spirit could doom a community. They nursed their sick with herbal remedies, using willow bark for pain and yarrow for wounds. They performed trepanation, drilling holes in skulls to relieve pressure from head injuries, a procedure that many survived. Their understanding of anatomy was intuitive, based on centuries of butchering animals and observing deaths. They knew that the heart pumped blood, that the lungs filled with air, and that the brain housed the soul. They believed that dreams were messages from ancestors, guiding them through the darkness. They painted their bodies with ochre and charcoal, transforming themselves into spirits for rituals. They danced until exhaustion, entering trance states where they felt connected to the cosmos. They saw themselves as part of a web of life, not masters of it. And then, around 11,000 years ago, something unprecedented happened. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, a group of humans decided to stay in one place. They had found a valley with wild wheat and barley, with rivers full of fish, with game that returned each season. They built permanent houses, with stone foundations and mud brick walls, roofs made from reeds. They began to tend the wild grains, weeding out competitors, watering them during dry spells. They selected the seeds from the largest plants, unconsciously beginning the process of domestication. It was not a sudden revolution. It was a gradual shift, a slow dance between humans and nature. But once they started, there was no turning back. Agriculture allowed for a surplus of food, which allowed for specialization, which allowed for hierarchy. Some people became full-time craftsmen, others became priests, and still others became warriors. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities, and cities into empires. Writing was invented to keep track of grain stores and debts. Laws were written to regulate behavior in crowded spaces. Kings claimed divine right to rule over thousands of subjects. All of this, the pyramids, the aqueducts, the libraries, the armies, rested on the foundation laid by Ice Age survivors. Every innovation, every discovery, every leap forward was built on their patience, their ingenuity, their resilience. They had faced the cold, the hunger, the darkness, and they had found a way through. They had not just survived. They had thrived, creating art, music, and spirituality in the harshest conditions Earth could offer. And when the ice melted, they did not disappear. They changed, they adapted, they evolved. Their bones lie beneath our cities. Their tools are buried in our fields. Their DNA flows through our veins. When you feel cold, you shiver because your ancestors adapted to the cold. When you feel hunger, your body knows how to conserve energy because they survived famines. When you feel fear, your brain processes it with the same circuits that help them detect predators. You are not separate from them. You are them, reborn in a warmer, more complex world. The fire they kindled still burns inside you. The songs they sang still echo in your voice. The stories they told still shape your dreams. So the next time you look at starry sky, remember that they looked at the same stars, wondering the same things. The next time you hold a tool, remember that they invented the concept of shaping stone to fit a hand. The next time you share a meal, remember that they first learned to share food for the good of the group. They were the first humans, but they were also the first to imagine a future beyond the next winter. And that imagination, that stubborn refusal to give up, is the greatest gift they left behind. It is the spark that ignited civilization. It is the reason you are here today, reading these words, connected to a past so distant it feels like myth. But it is not myth. It is history, written in bone and stone, in genes and memories. And it is still being written by you every day of your life.